The indigenous peoples of the Americas are the descendants of the pre-Columbian inhabitants of North and South America. Pueblos indígenas is a common term in Spanish-speaking countries. Aboriginal is used in Argentina, whereas Amerindian is used in Quebec and the Guianas but not commonly in other countries. Indigenous peoples are commonly known in Canada as Aboriginal peoples, which include First Nations, Inuit, and en.wikipedia peoples. Indigenous peoples of the United States are commonly known as Native Americans or American Indians, and Alaska Natives. According to the prevailing New World migration model, migrations of humans from Asia to the Americas took place via Bering Sea, a land bridge which connected the two continents across what is now the Bering Strait. The majority of experts agree that the earliest migration via Bering Sea took place at least 13,500 years ago, with disputed evidence that people had migrated into the Americas much earlier, up to 40,000 years ago. These early Paleo-Indians spread throughout the Americas, diversifying into many hundreds of culturally distinct nations and tribes. According to the oral histories of many of the indigenous peoples of the Americas, they have been living there since their genesis, described by a wide range of creation myths. Application of the term Indian originated with Christopher Columbus, who, in his search for Asia, thought that he had arrived in the East Indies. The Americas came to be known as the West Indies, a name still used to refer to the islands of the Caribbean Sea. This led to the names Indies and Indian, which implied some kind of racial or cultural unity among the Aboriginal peoples of the Americas. This unifying concept, codified in law, religion, and politics, was not originally accepted by indigenous peoples but has been embraced by many over the last 2 centuries. Even though the term Indian often does not include the Aleut, Inuit, or Yupik peoples, these groups are considered indigenous peoples of the Americas. Although some indigenous peoples of the Americas were traditionally hunter-gatherers, and many, especially in Amazonia, still are, many groups practiced aquaculture and agriculture. The impact of their agricultural endowment of the world is a testament to their time and work in reshaping and cultivating the flora indigenous to the Americas. Although some societies depended heavily on agriculture, others practiced a mix of farming, hunting, and gathering. In some regions, the indigenous peoples created monumental architecture, large-scale organized cities, chiefdoms, states, and empires. Many parts of the Americas are still populated by indigenous peoples. Some countries have sizable populations, especially Belize, Bolivia, Chile, Ecuador, Greenland, Guatemala, Mexico, and Peru. At least 1,000 different indigenous languages are spoken in the Americas. Some, such as Quechua, Aymara, Guarani, Mayan languages, and Nahuatl, count their speakers in millions. Many also maintain aspects of indigenous cultural practices to varying degrees, including religion, social organization, and subsistence practices. Like most cultures, over time, cultures specific to many indigenous peoples have evolved to incorporate traditional aspects, but also cater to modern needs. Some indigenous peoples still live in relative isolation from Western society, and a few are still counted as uncontacted peoples. History. Migration into the continents. The specifics of Paleo-Indian migration to and throughout the Americas, including the exact dates and routes traveled, provide the subject of ongoing research and discussion. According to archaeological and genetic evidence, North and South America were the last continents in the world with human habitation. During the Wisconsin glaciation, 50,000–17,000 years ago, falling sea levels allowed people to move across the Bering Land Bridge that joined Siberia to northwest North America. Alaska was ice-free because of low snowfall, allowing a small population to exist. The Laurentide ice sheet covered most of North America, blocking nomadic inhabitants and confining them to Alaska for thousands of years. Indigenous genetic studies suggest that the first inhabitants of the Americas share a single ancestral population, one that developed in isolation, conjectured to be Bering Year. The isolation of these peoples in Bering Year might have lasted 10,000–20,000 years. Around 16,500 years ago, the glaciers began melting, allowing people to move south and east into Canada and beyond. These people are believed to have followed herds of now extinct Pleistocene megafauna along ice-free corridors that stretched between the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets. Another route proposed involves migration, either on foot or using primitive boats, along the Pacific Northwest coast to South America. Evidence of the latter would have been covered by a sea level rise of more than 120 meters since the last ice age. The time range of 40,000–16,500 years ago is debatable and probably will remain so for years to come. The few agreements achieved to date include the origin from Central Asia, widespread habitation of the Americas during the end of the last glacial period, or more specifically what is known as the late glacial maximum, around 16,000–13,000 years before present. The Clovis culture, the earliest definitively dated prehistoric Paleo-Indian culture in the Americas, appears around 11,500 RCBP, equivalent to 13,500 to 13,000 calendar years ago. In 2014, the autosomal DNA of a 12,500-plus-year-old infant from Montana found in close association with several Clovis artifacts was sequenced. The data indicate that the individual was from a population directly ancestral to present South American and Central American Native American populations, and closely related to present North American Native American populations. The implication is that there was an early divergence between North American and Central American plus South American populations. Similarly, the skeleton of a teenage girl found in the underwater cave system of Sacactun in Mexico's eastern Yucatan Peninsula in 2007 has had DNA extracted, and at 13,000 years old is considered the oldest genetically intact human skeleton ever found in the Americas. The DNA indicates she was from a lineage derived from Asian origins that is represented in the modern native population's DNA. Stone tools, particularly projectile points and scrapers, are the primary evidence of the earliest human activity in the Americas. Crafted lithic flaked tools are used by archaeologists and anthropologists to classify cultural periods. Pre-Columbian era. The pre-Columbian era incorporates all period subdivisions in the history and prehistory of the Americas before the appearance of significant European and African influences on the American continents, spanning the time of the original settlement in the Upper Paleolithic to European colonization during the early modern period. While technically referring to the era before Christopher Columbus's voyages of 1492 to 1504. In practice, the term usually includes the history of American indigenous cultures until Europeans either conquered or significantly influenced them, even if this happened decades or even centuries after Columbus's initial landing. Pre-Columbian is used especially often in the context of discussing the great indigenous civilizations of the Americas, such as those of Mesoamerica and those of the Andes. Many pre-Columbian civilizations established characteristics and hallmarks which included permanent or urban settlements, agriculture, civic and monumental architecture, and complex societal hierarchies. Some of these civilizations had long faded by the time of the first significant European and African arrivals, and are known only through oral history and through archaeological investigations. Others were contemporary with this period, and are also known from historical accounts of the time. A few, such as the Mayan, Olmec, Mixtec, and Nahua peoples, had their own written records. However, the European colonists of the time worked to eliminate non-Christian beliefs, and Christian pious destroyed many pre-Columbian written records. Only a few documents remained hidden and survived, leaving contemporary historians with glimpses of ancient culture and knowledge. According to both indigenous American and European accounts and documents, American civilizations at the time of European encounter had achieved many accomplishments. For instance, the Aztecs built one of the largest cities in the world, Tenochtitlan, the ancient site of Mexico City, with an estimated population of 200,000. American civilizations also displayed impressive accomplishments in astronomy and mathematics. The domestication of maize or corn required thousands of years of selective breeding. Inuit, Alaskan Native, and American Indian creation myths tell of a variety of origins of their respective peoples. Some were always there, or were created by gods or animals. Some migrated from a specified compass point, and others came from across the ocean. European colonization. The European colonization of the Americas forever changed the lives and cultures of the peoples of the continents. Although the exact pre-contact population of the Americas is unknown, scholars estimate that Native American populations diminished by between 80 and 90% within the first centuries of contact with Europeans. The leading cause was disease. The continent was ravaged by epidemics of diseases such as smallpox, measles, and cholera, which were brought from Europe by the early explorers and spread quickly into new areas even before later explorers and colonists reached them. Native Americans suffered high mortality rates due to their lack of prior exposure to these diseases. The loss of lives was exacerbated by conflict between colonists and indigenous people. Colonists also frequently perpetrated massacres on the indigenous groups and enslaved them. According to the U.S. Bureau of the Census, the North American Indian Wars of the 19th century cost the lives of about 19,000 whites and 30,000 Native Americans. The first indigenous group encountered by Columbus were the 250,000 Tainos of Hispaniola, who represented the dominant culture in the Greater Antilles and the Bahamas. Within 30 years, about 70% of the Tainos had died. They had no immunity to European diseases, so outbreaks of measles and smallpox ravaged their population, increasing punishment of the Tainos for revolting against forced labor. Despite measures put in place by the encomienda, which included religious education and protection from warring tribes, eventually led to the last Great Taino Rebellion. Following years of mistreatment, the Tainos began to adopt suicidal behaviors, with women aborting or killing their infants and men jumping from the cliffs or ingesting manioc, a violent poison. Eventually, a Taino cacique named Enriquillo managed to hold out in the mountain range of Bahoruco for 13 years, causing serious damage to the Spanish, Carib-held plantations and their Indian auxiliaries. Hearing of the seriousness of the revolt, Emperor Charles V sent Captain Francisco Barronuevo to negotiate a peace treaty with the ever-increasing number of rebels. 2 months later, after consultation with the Audiencia of Santo Domingo, Enriquillo was offered any part of the island to live in peace. The Laws of Burgos, 1512–1513, were the first codified set of laws governing the behavior of Spanish settlers in America, particularly with regard to native Indians. The laws forbade the maltreatment of natives and endorsed their conversion to Catholicism. The Spanish crown found it difficult to enforce these laws in a distant colony. Various theories for the decline of the Native American populations emphasize epidemic diseases, conflicts with Europeans, and conflicts among warring tribes. Scholars now believe that, among the various contributing factors, epidemic disease was the overwhelming cause of the population decline of the American natives. Some believe that after first contacts with Europeans and Africans, Old World diseases caused the death of 90 to 95% of the native population of the New World in the following 150 years. Smallpox killed up to 1/3 of the native population of Hispaniola in 1518. By killing the Incan ruler Huayna Capac, smallpox had brought the Incas into a civil war. Smallpox was only the first epidemic. Typhus in 1546, influenza and smallpox together in 1558, smallpox again in 1589, diphtheria in 1614, measles in 1618, all ravaged the remains of Inca culture. Smallpox had killed millions of native inhabitants of Mexico. Unintentionally introduced at Veracruz with the arrival of Pánfilo de Narváez on April 23, 1520, smallpox ravaged Mexico in the 1520s, possibly killing over 150,000 in Tenochtitlan alone, and aiding in the victory of Hernán Cortés over the Aztec Empire at Tenochtitlan in 1521. Over the centuries, the Europeans had developed high degrees of immunity to these diseases, while the indigenous Americans had no immunity. Explorations of the Caribbean led to the discovery of the Arawak peoples of the Lesser Antilles. The culture was destroyed by 1650. Only 500 had survived by the year 1550, though the bloodlines continued through to the modern populace. In Amazonia, indigenous societies weathered centuries of colonization. Contact with European diseases such as smallpox and measles killed between 50 and 67% of the aboriginal population of North America in the first 100 years after the arrival of Europeans. Some 90% of the native population near Massachusetts Bay Colony died of smallpox in an epidemic in 1617 to 1619. In 1633, in Plymouth, the Native Americans there were exposed to smallpox because of contact with Europeans. As it had done elsewhere, the virus wiped out entire population groups of Native Americans. It reached Lake Ontario in 1636, and the lands of the Iroquois by 1679. During the 1770s, smallpox killed at least 30% of the West Coast Native Americans. Smallpox epidemics in 1780 to 1782 and 1837 to 1838 brought devastation and drastic population depletion among the Plains Indians. In 1832, the federal government of the United States established a smallpox vaccination program for Native Americans. In Brazil, the indigenous population declined from a pre-Columbian high of an estimated 3 million to some 300,000 in 1997. The Spaniards and other Europeans brought horses to the Americas. Some of these animals escaped and began to breed and increase their numbers in the wild. The reintroduction of the horse, extinct in the Americas for over 7,500 years, had a profound impact on Native American culture in the Great Plains of North America and of Patagonia in South America. By domesticating horses, some tribes had great success. Horses enabled them to expand their territories, exchange more goods with neighboring tribes, and more easily capture game, especially bison. Agriculture. Over the course of thousands of years, American indigenous peoples domesticated, bred and cultivated a large array of plant species. These species now constitute 50 to 60% of all crops in cultivation worldwide. In certain cases, the indigenous peoples developed entirely new species and strains through artificial selection, as was the case in the domestication and breeding of maize from wild teosinte to grasses in the valleys of southern Mexico. Numerous such agricultural products retain their native names in the English and Spanish lexicons. The South American highlands were a center of early agriculture. Genetic testing of the wide variety of cultivars and wild species suggests that the potato has a single origin in the area of southern Peru, from a species in the Solanum brevicore complex. Over 99% of all modern cultivated potatoes worldwide are descendants of a subspecies indigenous to south-central Chile, Solanum tuberosum ssp. tuberosum, where it was cultivated as long as 10,000 years ago. According to George Roudsons, it is clear that in pre-Columbian times some groups struggled to survive and often suffered food shortages and famines. While others enjoyed a varied and substantial diet, the persistent drought around 850 AD coincided with the collapse of classic Maya civilization, and the famine of one rabbit was a major catastrophe in Mexico. Natives of North America began practicing farming approximately 4,000 years ago, late in the Archaic period of North American cultures. Technology had advanced to the point that pottery was becoming common and the small-scale felling of trees had become feasible. Concurrently, the archaic Indians began using fire in a controlled manner. Intentional burning of vegetation was used to mimic the effects of natural fires that tended to clear forest understories. It made travel easier and facilitated the growth of herbs and berry-producing plants, which were important for both food and medicines. In the Mississippi River Valley, Europeans noted Native Americans managed groves of nut and fruit trees not far from villages and towns in their gardens and agricultural fields. Further away, prescribed burning would have been used in forest and prairie areas. Many crops first domesticated by indigenous Americans are now produced and used globally. Chief among these is maize or corn, arguably the most important crop in the world. Other significant crops include cassava, chia, squash, the pinto bean, phaseolus beans including most common beans, tepary beans and lima beans, tomatoes, potatoes, avocados, peanuts, cocoa beans, vanilla, strawberries, pineapples, peppers, sunflower seeds, rubber, Brazil wood, chicle, tobacco, coca, manioc and some species of cotton. Studies of contemporary indigenous environmental management, including agroforestry practices among its Zamaya in Guatemala and hunting and fishing among the Menominee of Wisconsin, suggest that long-standing, sacred values may represent a summary of sustainable millennial traditions.